Morning. We're going to be in John chapter 6 today. I want to begin us at verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and he sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near, and then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So that when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This truly is the prophet who has come into the world." You know, this is a passage that we all probably know very well. And the idea came from a nail bucket this week. We were working on the siding, and as we tore down all the old stuff, we saved all the nails, and we filled this bucket with them. We'll reuse them; they're still good. And we're probably, a little over a third of the way done with the siding, maybe coming up on about halfway done, and it doesn't seem like that bucket of nails has gone down at all. And we were here yesterday, and I said something about that to Dad. I'm like, it seems like that bucket's not going down any, and it made me think of these loaves and fishes. There was just more and more and more for Jesus to provide. Random thought that pulled me to that, but this is such an important message and such an important display by Jesus. This is the only miracle in the Gospels that's recorded in all 4 Gospel accounts. And for a time when we seem like we have limitless needs and limitless problems and limitless crazy situations, we need a reminder sometimes that we've got a limitless God and that he is limitless in his ability to provide and to meet our needs, to care for us. In verse 5, Jesus said, he asked Philip a question. He said, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" And it goes on to say that this was a test question. He knew what he was going to do. He knew how he was going to feed them. It says in the other accounts that the disciples were actually suggesting, there's a lot of people here, it's getting late, maybe we ought to just send them on into town and let them provide for themselves and go buy their own food and get some lodging. And Jesus wanted to minister to them and meet their needs. He saw a need in them. He had a compassion for them. He knew that they were hungry, but he knew they needed more than that. And he was prepared to meet that need. But he asked him this test question, and how does Philip respond? He says, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" And Philip responded, saying, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Now, a denarii, as we've talked about before, it was about a day's worth of pay. So he's basically saying, 200 days worth of pay isn't enough to get enough food for these people. Even with that much, 7-8 months worth of wages, if we had all that, it still wouldn't be enough to give them but a little bit. In today's context, that might be like saying, we'd need like $15,000 to come up with enough food for these people. And that sounds unreasonable on a moment's notice for a lot of situations, a lot of people. Definitely, our church, we're not just going to be like, all right, let's pull together 15,000 real quick to feed this crowd outside. It's just not, it's doable, but usually not on a moment's notice. But that wasn't what was needed. Jesus, as we see here, he didn't need a penny to do what he did. It didn't matter how much or how little they had. He wasn't going to be limited. We've been kind of conditioned to have a mindset of, if I can throw enough money at a problem, it'll fix it. If I can come up with this much money, things will get better. Or if I have just enough to pay for that or to take care of that, it's going to take care of the situation. And sometimes money can ease a situation. If your problem is that you have to pay a bill and you have the money and you pay that bill, that takes care of it. But it's not always the only way. Most of the time it's not. And if we're just focusing on what resources we need, what things we have, where does that leave room for faith? And that's what he wanted them to see here. God's not limited by our limitations. God's ability to bless and to provide isn't limited by what we can bring to him. And Philip, what he was doing here, he was calculating their limitations. He was doing the math on just how limited they were, instead of looking to faith to see how limitless God was here. He did what we do a lot of the time. We think, what? Maybe God wants me to do this. Maybe he's calling me to something, but I'm really limited by the amount of time I have. I'm really limited by the amount of money I have. I'm limited by the energy, the ability I have. I'm limited by my strength. Maybe I'm limited in wisdom. There's no way I can do this. And when we turn our focus to our own limitations, sometimes we kind of superimpose those on God, even inadvertently. We're limiting what we're able to do in a situation based on what we have, and we're not taking into account his limitlessness. And that's a mindset that we need to break. We think like Andrew did in verse 8. Even once he saw, 8 and 9, even once he saw this bread and this fish that was ultimately going to be what Jesus used to provide. He said, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? What good is this going to do? This isn't enough. We don't have enough. I don't have enough. What can I do? Listen, when you bring what you do have to Jesus, when you're willing to offer God what you do have, when you're willing to do, well, like Paul said in our study passage today, when you're willing to make your body a living sacrifice, when you're willing to give it all to God, he'll make it enough. Maybe under normal circumstances, we can count the cost of things and say, this isn't enough to do this, but this alone might not be enough to do this. But when we bring it all to God, he makes it enough. Notice that boy didn't hold back anything. Notice he didn't say, you know what, I'm hungry. You can have 3 of these loaves and 1 of the fish, but I got to have my lunch. He gave it all to them. He offered it all to them, and Jesus blessed tremendously through it. Verse 10, Jesus said, make the people sit down. There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. It says in the other Gospels that they sectioned them off into groups of 50 or 100 people here and there. Maybe that was just to make sure they reached everybody. I'm not sure why he grouped them that way. But this is saying, it says that there were 5,000 men there, and we think of this as the feeding of 5,000, but that's just the men. There were likely women and children there too. This, what we often think of as 5,000, very easily could have been 10 to 20,000 people. With just a little pile of food. This is one of those things in the Bible that the skeptics think is just like a metaphor or a fairy tale or unrealistic, too unrealistic to believe. It is one of the stories that the skeptics just can't swallow. It's a magnificent display of God's power. Verse 11 says, Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down. Likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. You know, these people, why did they follow him? It says early on in this passage that they saw the signs that he performed. They saw these miracles that he was performing. They saw that he was healing people. And in a lot of cases, people were following because they wanted healing. A lot of people were following him because they heard what he was teaching and they were intrigued by him. You know, he just had that draw that was drawing people to him. But there would have been a lot of people who were just looking for a healing. And he performed a lot of those healings for them. He met their spiritual needs, but he also met their physical needs. Beyond the healing, beyond the teaching, he fed them. He fed their physical bodies, physical food. And, you know, our goal as God's people, whether as a church or whether as individuals, ought to be to feed people spiritually. It ought to be to lead people to Jesus, to share the gospel with them. It ought to be to disciple one another and to grow together. But a lot of times, we also, it benefits everyone to help meet their physical needs as well. And that can be a great outreach and a great ministry. You know, sometimes, maybe it's a meal, maybe it's a listening ear, maybe it's helping them through just one of life's struggles. You'd be amazed how many times that'll open up the door to have a genuine conversation with someone. Maybe on a bigger scale, it's a some kind of church charity event or things like that might open up doorways and conversations with people. But on an individual basis, you know, I know that we talk a lot about how many struggles each one of us individually has, but I know from talking to pretty much everybody here that we're not alone. There's a lot of people in our own lives, in our own circles, friends, family, co-workers who are struggling with things, who are suffering through a lot of painful and trying things. And I also know that a lot of you are being there for them and ministering to them in different ways. And they see that, and God sees that. You know, we can't minimize the impact that the little things can have. We don't know what little things can help grow and spread into bigger things. God knows. That's why he calls us to things that sometimes we think are insignificant. Where did that little boy get the food? Maybe mom packed that for his lunch that day. Maybe dad said, here's some money, go down to the market and pick it up and bring it home. Maybe somebody played a role here that they never got credit for. Maybe there's an unnamed mother or father or someone in this story who did something little that they thought was so insignificant, and it ended up leading to Jesus performing this massive, miraculous display. And they may never even have known it. They may have no idea. Well, now I'm sure they know. But at the time, I'm sure they didn't realize that morning what their little act was going to lead to. And there are a lot of things that maybe God calls us to, or maybe we just feel a draw to do, or maybe to say to someone. And we think, you know what, this is so tiny and insignificant, maybe it's not going to make a difference. Why bother? It's not a big deal. We don't know how badly they might need that. We don't know how badly they might just need one kind word or one kind act. We need to think about that when we think something is insignificant, something doesn't matter. When we plant seeds with people and we don't see the growth, maybe they're not receptive. We don't know what God's going to do with it. Verse 12, after he had fed them, so when they were filled, after everybody was, they didn't just get a few morsels, everybody was filled. Beyond that, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." There ended up being 12 baskets worth of food. He had just this tiny little, probably one, maybe two baskets with 5 little loaves and 2 fish, and fed thousands and thousands of people, gathered up what was left, and still had an excess, an abundance, after everybody else is stuffed, of 12 full baskets. Why? Jesus could have made that last until it got to the last person and then run out. He could have made it just enough to sustain them so that they weren't too hungry. He didn't have to fill everybody up. He could have just held them over a little bit. It makes me think of Ephesians 3, where Paul writes that God can do exceedingly abundantly above and beyond anything that we can ask or imagine or think. He didn't let anything go to waste. They had all this excess, and they could have just tossed it on the ground and moved on. When God blesses us, don't let it go to waste. Now, that might be, there are a lot of different ways he can bless us. And often he blesses us far beyond what we need. But we can't let it go to waste. We can't take it for granted. We can't lose sight of it and toss it aside. Think of the gifts that he blesses us with, the spiritual gifts that he blesses us with. Do we use them? Do we appreciate and build on them and put them to good use? He doesn't give us things to waste. And if he's blessed us exceedingly abundantly beyond what we could have asked for, what we could have thought of, bless somebody else with it. There are a lot of different ways God blesses us and that we can pass forward. Think of, even aside from, we think of blessings as things like monetary or physical provision and things like that. But what about the way God blesses us by comforting us and then tells us that we can take that same comfort and go bless someone else who needs it? Whether it's an internal blessing or an external blessing, share it with somebody. Has God blessed you with peace? Go find somebody who's struggling with a need for peace and show them where to find it. Just like here. He gave them far beyond what they needed, but nothing went to waste. They gathered up what was left. Verse 13. Therefore they gathered them up and filled the 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This truly is the prophet who has come into the world." Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Seeing this, it was pretty obvious that this isn't just your average guy. This isn't your average everyday person who's just able to do something so miraculous. They saw him for who he was, and they actually refer to him as this prophet. They realized that he was the Savior that's been prophesied about, that they had been expecting. This actually references in Deuteronomy 17, refers to him as a prophet. But again, what were they expecting in this Messiah? They were expecting this earthly king. They were expecting a leader of an earthly kingdom, maybe to release them from Roman rule or something like that. But that's not what he was here for. And that's why he slipped away before they tried to put him in that leadership role. Because their ideas were just a limitation of what he really was going to do. They could have Just like how they theoretically could have scrimped up 200 denarii and barely taken care of the people, he did exceedingly abundantly beyond that. And just as, they could have grabbed him up and made him an earthly leader, but he was ready to go exceedingly abundantly beyond that. That's why he was here. He wasn't here to lead a physical army. He wasn't here to sit on a throne and give out orders. He was here to go to that cross. He was here to save us far beyond what they could have expected or asked or thought. We see in this story that God has an infinite ability to meet our needs, to bless, to watch over us, to care for his people. But it goes beyond an infinite ability to provide sustenance and things. We know that he's got an infinite ability to forgive us. He's got an infinite ability to restore us. When we think of our limitations like they were thinking of, a lot of times we think of our limitations in terms of, I can't go to God for forgiveness because I'm too big of a mess. They have that I've screwed up too big, I'm going to hell anyway kind of attitude. And they're placing the limitations of the kind of forgiveness that people often give on God. And just like this food, he goes above and beyond. He would forgive us for more than what we've done because he loves us. That's why he was here. He wasn't here to go sit on a throne and be throwing feasts and things like that. He was here to establish a spiritual kingdom that went well above and beyond, that would feed everyone and have baskets to spare. That's what we've got to remember when we think of God's calling in our lives or any kind of limitation that we feel we're just not ready for. Or maybe I'm not good enough to do this. Maybe you should go ask somebody else, God. We've got to remember there's nothing that's holding him back. We might be trying to hold ourselves back, but nothing's holding him back. And he can bless infinitely.